Hi, Bobak.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, great to see you. Um,
Likewise.
we're going to jump into you just real quick, though. I just wanted to congratulate Mike Shoding. Mike, where are you? Ah, there you are, Mike. So, yes. There's a very beautiful text by Jack Awashna, who's Mike's mentor. And Mike, we're so proud of you. Mike is now a tenured professor at the University of Michigan. Mike, any words?
I have no words other than I couldn't do that with I could not do it without all of you in the community. So thank you.
Oh, that's so kind of you to say that. But anyway, it's spectacular. You've been kind of one of the founders of MiCHAMP, so it's really wonderful to see all the success you've had, and we're so proud of you and all the work you've been doing. So, but great. All right, Bobak Mortazavi. I've known Bobak for a number of years, mentee of Harlan Krumholtz, as many of us are, and really just fundamental in terms of how his group has thought about data science and its connections with healthcare. And so I saw Bobak last week at QCore, and I'm excited to see him again here virtually. And we've got to make sure we bring him here to campus. So Bobak, welcome to MiCHAMP.
Thanks. Appreciate the introduction and the invite to talk. Excited to present, and yeah, likewise in the future would be thrilled to come and get an opportunity to speak in person and get to have some more interactions with individuals. So let's just jump right into it here. Let me share my screen. Let's see, does everybody see that? I believe so, and I'm going to slide the chat over here. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat as well.
Yeah, it's there. And Bobak, can I just say, I was wondering whether you came up with that or Brad Trumpauer came up.
No, I was about to just give credit to. I don't know who put this figure up, but I loved it and I stole it.
All right, so it was Brad's genius. Okay, all right.
Fantastic. Gotta love the meme. So all right, well, thanks for coming to my talk today, everybody. I'm excited to talk to you about some of the fantastic work that we're doing, myself and our collaborators, some of whom Ramaji just mentioned. Gonna shift slightly to talking about wearable sensing. Our group sort of sits in between the idea of wearable sensing and remote health, and then sort of more data science and applications of machine learning techniques to clinical outcomes research, particularly cardiovascular outcomes. So we're going to use that actually as the motivation today. We're going to sort of start as the idea of how do we develop end-to-end systems to really track cardiovascular care from in the hospital to out of the hospital, and then preventing getting back into clinical settings. And this talk will primarily focus on what happens when you walk out. Happy offline to talk about some of the sort of more standard data science and machine learning techniques in electronic health records and things offline if people are interested. But let's talk primarily about hypertension. So there are a number of risk factors that lead to poor cardiovascular outcomes, and one of the primary ones is hypertension. There was a recent Lancet commission that talked about how hypertension is actually probably one of the most modifiable physiological biomarkers that drives future cardiovascular risk. So how do you prevent hypertension? How do you treat hypertension? How do you avoid sort of sustained elevated blood pressure that causes sort of these longer term degradations in arterial compliance, and then eventually towards cardiovascular and stroke risk. And what has been more and more relevant in the literature, and I'll try to touch on this only lightly because there are cardiologists here who I'm sure can speak to this better than I can, but it's that one of the things that we've been noticing is that in clinic, blood pressures may not actually be the most predictive of what's going to happen. You have things like white coat hypertension, where you get super nervous when you show up in front of your doctor, and then it looks like you have high blood pressure when you don't. One phenomenon that I'm not as familiar with that seems interesting to me is the opposite of that. When you go to the clinic and your hypertension actually seems to be masked and hidden, but then during the days it's higher. And there's been recent work in the past few years that have shown that if you take ambulatory blood pressure, so you have this cuff and this device and it inflates frequently over the course of 24 hours, that this is actually more accurate than clinic blood pressure in identifying your level of blood pressure and your cardiovascular risks moving forward. And in particular, one of the things that it actually highlights is the ability to identify nocturnal non-dipping hypertension. And so in a nocturnal non-dipping hypertension, when you go to sleep, your blood pressure is not dropping the sort of requisite 10% in terms of systolic that you would want to see. And so we sort of looked at this, and we're looking at sort of what are these modifiable factors that we can track remotely over time, and seeing, boy, gee, that seems like an obvious one that I personally think about wearing these things, and seems like it'd be completely infeasible to track the blood pressure during sleep with a cuff that's inflating. So we tracked exactly that, actually. So our colleagues at Yale have this great Center for Equity and Health Research in what they consider to be high risk and high stress environments. And there's a sub-study that we ran within that tries to look at the impacts of these things on blood pressure. So participants are giving survey responses. They're wearing an activity monitor for a period of 72 hours, and they're actually wearing an ambulatory blood pressure monitor for 24 hours. And the idea here is that they give a self-report of when they think they're awake and when they think they're asleep. And while they're awake, the blood pressure monitor goes off every 24 hours. And when they're, every 30 minutes. And when they're asleep, it goes off every hour, with the idea being that this gives you reasonable awake and sleep blood pressures to get a sense of what they're doing. So, I led into this study and was immediately confused by how these things work, because it occurs to me personally that I would not want to be wearing a cuff that would go off every hour while I sleep. I'm not always the deepest sleeper, and I feel like that would wake me up all the time. So it just sort of seemed like an obvious annoyance. And sure enough, as we collected the data and started looking at it, started to see that, that seems to be a problem here. So these participants wear this actigraph for 72 hours, and the 24 hours that they wear the blood pressure monitor, their sleep is statistically significantly shorter by about an hour than on nights it's not. And it makes it harder and harder to actually get a sense of what their resting blood pressure should be. So for example, you take the following graph here, and you've got the systolic blood pressure reading over a 24-hour profile for one of the participants of the study. We've got about 70. And the red are what they self-report as when they should be awake, and the blue are when they self-reported that they should be asleep. So you see the frequent measurements drop to about an hour at a time, and then we also just sort of segmented what is the midnight to 6 a.m. period that we think most people would be asleep. And you look at these readings, and what happens here is, becomes an important question for us is, well, does this person have appropriate nocturnal dipping, or are they a nocturnal non-dipping hypertensive patient? They seem like they're normotensive, right? The overall average blood pressure is about under 120. You have a few outliers that are a little high in these regions up here, but overall the blood pressure seems pretty low. But you have an interesting question here of what's happening, that the blood pressure seems to be dipping, and then it rockets back up here while they're supposedly asleep, drops back down, and then comes back up. And this outlier right here, I can tell you, ends up resulting in them being classified as a non-dipper, because the overall sleep average gets lifted so much by this singular point. But then you look at the actigraph, and you see that, boy, we probably should not be counting this point as sleep blood pressure, because whereas they're very clearly sedentary during this period of time, they seem to wake up pretty early on in the morning. Right, so they're pretty active, and these three last points definitely don't count as hypertensive. So, you can reclassify it and say, all right, well, once I have activity recognition, I can track sleep and say, it seems most likely that you're asleep in this period, just shorter than you self-reported, but I can remark what I consider awake and what I consider asleep, and in this case, the individual does actually fall back under the threshold of appropriately nocturnally dipping. That sort of seems to present the grand challenge for all of us then, because depending on how you classify it on the self-report, or just picking certain periods of time, or different types of actigraphy and monitoring, your classification of your level of hypertensive risk changes. And if it changes, how can you really reliably trust that a model is going to get a good representation of what your blood pressure is and carry this forward? And so that leads us into our motivation for the talk today. We sort of looked at this and said, gee, there's a lot of things about ambulatory cuffs that seem challenging to use, right? It's waking people up, it's disturbing. That's sort of a clean cut case. I can show you cases where there's a disturbance around some of the readings, and it's, then it raises the question of, did they wake up? Did they not wake up? So it would be great if we could get something that could measure more frequently to get a better sense of what your blood pressure is when you're awake and what you are when you're asleep. and not disturb you at the same time. And so we work with a team across biomedical engineers to cardiologists to design unique cuffless hardware. And then my group primarily focuses on the challenging tasks of relating that information back to blood pressure so that we can eventually develop future clinical studies. So let me just briefly explain where we can get some things here. So the beauty of it is that there are actually non-invasive signals that are related to blood pressure. So whereas they can't give you the exact measurements because of a cuff-based device that's literally looking at the amount of pressure that's being applied, there are hemodynamic parameters that we can track that on a beat-to-beat basis do represent changes to blood pressure over each heartbeat, right? So if you've got your ECG tracking when each beat happens, and then you've got a PPG, photoplasmography on your wrist, tracking when that pulse wave then arrives here with an influx of red blood cells, I can get a sense of how long it takes the pulse to travel down my arm. And it turns out that that pulse transit time and the velocity with which the pulse wave is traveling is related to blood pressure. So what we look at is, how do we design hardware that can get this information for us cufflessly? Ben, you have a question?
Yeah. How closely related are those parameters? Like, what's the R square between this and blood pressure?
So that's actually what we're going to get into for most of the talk, right? So it's not directly related at all. So if you just sort of took the pulse transit time and no other information, and then you tracked it against systolic blood pressure, you wouldn't be able to predict it at all. And it's because you're missing a lot of factors. You're missing factors about the arterial compliance of the particular individual, their age, their BMI. But if you measure delta changes in blood pressure and delta changes in pulse transit time, you do get more of a correlated signal. But how correlated is that, and how well can you actually regress that to systolic blood pressure is going to sort of be the primary goal of all the analytics that we're going to talk about today. So it's a fantastic question to set it up. So is it a follow-on question? Yep.
Yeah, sorry. So you're saying across individuals, just to clarify, across individuals, the correlation is very complicated and not that strong. But maybe the second part, if I'm reading it correctly or understanding it correctly, is that within an individual, the correlation might be much, much stronger. Is that right? And if so, what's that second piece?
Yes, that's correct. Is in that there is sort of a fixed model that represents the changes in the pulse transit time and the relation to the changes in blood pressure. So the pulse transit time is effectively the derivative in this case of the blood pressure measurements. I don't have an exact correlation for you for those parameters because we don't have a number of the other parameters that feed into getting this to fit accurately, which is the things like what is your arterial compliance and such that play into it. So so within an individual, that's sort of what we're going to show is how high can I push that correlation and represent it. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but we can get to a relationship of 0.8, 0.85 R squared in terms of measuring changes in these non-invasive signals to changes in blood pressure.
Bobak, did you see Karandeep's comment too?
No, I did not. Kind of V equals IR, but yeah, to some extent, that's exactly right. That's...
Great.
Great. So let me just a brief moment call out our biomedical engineering partners here. Ruzva Jafari's lab works really closely with us in terms of developing these hardware, and his student at the time, Bassem, who's now a graduated PhD, started designing some sensors for us to help solve this problem. And they actually went the different route than probably something that you have seen and familiar with. We've avoided photoplasmography. We're actually going with bioimpedance, so electrical impedance, to track along the radial artery what a pulse wave looks like. So we can design a watch type device that will sit on the radial artery and track the pulse wave along this to understand your individual changes, to develop an individualized model so that we can get some relationship of what your blood pressure changes look like without needing to know all of the other sort of latent factors here. I don't want to dive into the hardware too much. I'll direct you towards their group if you're more interested in the physics and the dynamics here. But effectively, the reason we use the bioimpedance, the electrical impedance, is able to penetrate deeper into the skin with this. So as we're able to penetrate deeper, we actually do better than light-based sort of PPG things that really get a sense of what's going on at the capillary level. And what we hypothesize is that actually that pulse transit time plus pulse perfusion into the capillaries gives you a bit of delay. And while it's feasible to use an ECG in a PPG or a dual PPG setting, and we'll show that in a little bit, longer term, we think this will do better for us because we can actually identify where the artery is and really just track the pulse along the radial artery. And we have developed and prototyped a sort of wearable device. It's not quite in a watch form factor yet, but for every study that's carried forward today, this is sort of the device here that is collecting the bioimpedance, the BioZ data that we're gonna use to relate to blood pressure. So in that respect, actually, we'll talk about the two setups real quick. We have our self-collected data. What we did is we took these, for now, healthy participants with no known cardiovascular disorder or hypertensive diagnoses, and we put this device on them, and then we walked them through and put a Phenopress beat-to-beat blood pressure monitor on them, and it tracked what their blood pressure looks like as we capture device over about an 1.5-hour period. And over that 1.5-hour period, we run them through a series of trials, cold pressor tests, Valsalva maneuvers, hand grips to manipulate the blood pressure to get a range of pulse transit time and pulse wave velocity and bioimpedance morphology changes over the course of changes in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And to also correlate back to ECG and PPG type signals, we also look at different participants in the MIMIC ICU waveform database, where we have arterial lines giving us the real-time arterial blood pressure flow, as well as ECG and PPG signals. And for those, we try to segment out for the time being the sort of healthiest participants, those that are effectively stepped down from operations rather than those with severe adverse events. So when we collected, so this actually comes back to the question that was just asked, right, about this relationship and what is the relationship and can you model it? So we tried to visualize very quickly the changes in pulse transit time and the changes in systolic blood pressure over some of the participants that we had and where the challenge is, right? So the issue here is physiologically modeling the data seems to have the same relationship over all the participants, right? As the pulse transit time changes, the blood pressure falls, because the heart's not beating as hard and as fast, but there's significant variation here. And a natural question to ask is, if I collected over thousands of participants, would I get nice relationships of people that are maybe more at risk for hypertension versus less at risk for hypertension, understanding the arterial compliance, et cetera. And our hope over time is that yes, but the question is, how can you make this stuff feasible in the short term as you're collecting data to start achieving interesting clinical goals here without, delaying for 5 years of just trying to capture data. The natural question becomes, from a machine learning point of view, it seems like the model exists here that represents pulse transit time and the morphologies of the waveforms to blood pressure, but that there's a data shift across participants. So how do we account for that? And so that's sort of what we're going to jump into now for the stuff that I do, is saying, all right, how do I take what effectively looks like noisy wearable signals and get a high correlation and high relationship to the actual blood pressure measurements so that I can hand this device off to cardiologists and have them use it. So what we do is we're going to go step by step and first trying to build personalized models and then go towards what it would be to create a more general model that would be applicable and active across all cases, so that in the end goal here, I can give you a device, you see somebody in a clinic, and in a matter of minutes, you can calibrate this device for them and have them walk out the door and have it be accurate. That's the goal.
Bobak, I before just jumping into that, can you go back to that slide? Do you mind just like kind of setting us up a little bit more? Because I think that, what you're proposing to do goes against a lot of common things that we've been taught and stuff, particularly about, inferring, from some of these cuffless signals, blood pressure and stuff. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So right now you're saying that you can't know the absolute value of blood pressure, and that's going to vary across individuals. But then this transit time that you're measuring is indicating, at least in these early data, that there's a relationship, and so that can tell us declines across or within individual differences. And I know this is probably obvious to many folks here, but it's probably non-obvious to many folks too. So I just want to make sure we're doing the baseline setting. And now you're going to go back and try to see if you can take these signals and come up with something that's a more meaningful clinical variable or feature that you can share with clinicians. Is that?
Yeah, exactly right. So the argument here is that I can very quickly demonstrate that there is some relationship here between the changes in these morphologies from a beat-to-beat basis to changes in blood pressure from a beat-to-beat basis. And the question effectively is, how do you develop a model that can effectively integrate back the signal from what is the delta blood pressure to what is the absolute blood pressure? So what do you have in terms of grounding or anchoring characteristics that, for example, if I put you in a clinic and I took your blood pressure with this watch on and a cuff and said, okay, it's 120/80. Now for the next day, I can just track the delta over 80 and still accurately be tracking your blood pressure.
That's really the goal. You're going to get a traditional method to just set the absolute value, and then you're going to be able to. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Yep.
Anybody have any questions right now about that, or? Okay. Oh, Venk,
Sorry, just to clarify. So those curves, just so I'm understanding, because I'm not totally following, right? Because so that's each color is for a separate individual in this experiment where you've measured the systolic or diastolic blood pressure and related it to the pulse transit time.
Yes.
And the curve comes out of, I'm assuming, some sort of non-linear fitting of that relationship.
Yes.
But the question I have is, how close are the actual measured points to those curves?
Again, that's sort of where we're going to be going here. So I'm going to show the relationship of how close can we get to measuring these to get a high correlation.
So in a sense, the curves come out of your model here, and they're not the actual data, right? And just so I'm understanding.
Well, in this case, right. I mean, this is sort of an illustrative example of the lines of best fit. So what we're going to do is say, how do I develop a model where I can actually say, how close is it? What's the error? How many millimeters of mercury error am I off at any given point in time?
All right, let's get into it.
Well, actually,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
I think Meg is just asking: is this like a low S curve? Is this like a like? There are points underlying this, and this is just a smooth visualization of that, right?
Yeah, it's just a polynomial regression on top of
but I think what Venk's asking a bit is, we can definitely see that each individual here has some sort of different intercept in which they're starting from. But what this data doesn't show us is, if you model this slope or this nonlinear line for each individual, what's the R squared for an individual? Like, what's the noise that is still there?
So so in this case, right, the R squared is going to be 0.6, 0.7, and what we're going to do is try to see if we can't bump that up towards 0.9.
Cool.
All right, great.
So where do we start with? So there's some interesting questions here in terms of, can you develop just some extracted features and stick them into sort of a standard logistic regression model or a nonlinear model or an XGBoost kind of thing? And those are some techniques we'll compare against. But one of the questions that comes up is, while we know the relationship to some extent is this pulse transit time to changes, there's the potential to explore more of the morphology differences in sort of a deeper approach that's able to automate feature extraction. So we have the ability with some of these recurrent neural networks to look over sequences of heartbeats and have it learn sort of patterns to then understand how those patterns relate to actual regressive networks to blood pressure, so systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So the sort of base that we would set up naively is the following: is throw a bunch of this data in, you have the labels that you're getting from the phenopress as a beat-to-beat data, and then you sort of get a sense of what's happening in the hemodynamic parameters, what's changing, and then how those changes relate to actual systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And then you model that and you get a pretty terrible performance. So I think maybe this is the question, and I should have jumped to this sooner, of what does that look like in terms of actually modeling those things, and keeping track of the relationship. And again, while the correlation is okay, because while it's flat, and then when it increases, it increases. You know, the root mean squared error here is going to be pretty terrible. And the reason is that for the most part, the blood pressure is 120/80. And so it's going to tend towards predicting 120/80. And more importantly, for each beat, whereas I know roughly what should be happening characteristically in the bioimpedance, which is I have a high electrical impedance, I get this heartbeat come in and it drops, and then I see it eventually rise back up to what's the next sort of diastolic point for the next heartbeat. At the same blood pressure, each individual has sort of a different relationship. And so if I smooth and average all this out, then I get basically noise. So yeah, it looks like there's a lot of noise in the target signal on slide 18. Yeah, so that's an interesting question too that we're going to move towards, which is, you know, a phenopress device that's giving you beat to beat blood pressure. Why is it showing such variance with respect to what it's getting? Is the heart rate, is the blood pressure really bouncing around every couple there, or is that device itself introducing error? And should there be some kind of smoothing and averaging? That's actually sort of an outstanding question that we're still looking at, which is to say, if I'm gathering this information, is it really important that I'm critically right at every single individual point, or are there, say, 30-second chunks of time that over that time, if I know what the time in range is, that I can say average what's going on there? And that's actually, you know, I open that up if somebody has a great comment on that.
Yeah, just a question to the cardiologist, like, what is the gold standard here? I mean, is it the blood pressure of the cuff? Is it the central blood pressure? Like,
well, could you tell us, Bobak, that these data are, when you say beat to beat, is this like an invasive monitor? Or?
So in this case, no. In this case, it's, so on the mimic side, when we talk about it, yeah, it's an arterial line.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
this, it's a phenopress device. If you're not familiar with the phenopress device, it's a brachial cuff and a finger cuff. And you sit in the, you know, in the standard position, feet on the ground, arms level, equal. And what it does is it'll take the brachial cuff will inflate, the finger cuff will inflate, and it'll use the brachial cuff to calibrate the finger cuff, and then it will leave the finger cuff inflated so that every heartbeat through the finger, it's measuring the blood pressure and correlating that internally back to what it thinks the brachial cuff would be measuring. So that it's a cuff-based device, but it's giving you for every heartbeat what is the blood pressure. As a result, it'll give you a pressure waveform that it thinks is well correlated and has been shown, you know, through standards to be similar to what, you know, an arterial line would be capturing.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, I think it'd be interesting to just kind of maybe let Bobak go a little bit longer, but I think one of the things that I keep thinking about through this, and Venk can weigh in as well, and others. I know that I think I see David Kent on this, and Karandeep probably has some clinical thoughts, and Jeremy too. But you know, when we think about blood pressure and outcomes, it's literally like these clinical based measures, and I'd say only in the last couple of decades have people started to tie some of these circadian rhythms that Bobak's talking about, nocturnal dipping, and there's other types of descriptive phenotypes of different blood pressures that have been linked, you know, to outcomes too. But in some ways, you know, who the hell knows? Maybe the estimated SBP is more correlated with outcomes than the, you know, target SBP based on this device measurement. I have no idea, and so I doubt that the clinical relevance of that is going to be huge. But you know, one thing might be also variability within the signals too. Might be, you know, its own signal as well. But I don't know, Venk, do you have any thoughts about that? I think that, you know, as we start to get into circadian rhythms or these beat-to-beat variability, I think we're getting really outside of, you know, yes, it's blood pressure measurement, but it's not like the classic way in which we've thought and kind of felt about hypertension and its relationship to outcomes over literally decades.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mean blood pressure is clearly a very powerful risk factor that we haven't fully treated all of that risk in that population by a long shot. There's a lot of untreated hypertension there, and I think early on, Bobak made some really nice points about white coat hypertension and how that might lead to overtreatment and toxicities of blood pressure therapy, and some nice points also about masked hypertension, which we might not be recognizing. But unlike, say, cholesterol, where there really probably are minimal toxicities to kind of over-aggressively treating cholesterol, meaning once you start someone on meds, to get them lower is there really harm from getting someone's LDL lower than your target? There are actual real harms to lowering blood pressure too far. And so actually, for me, one of the interesting questions, more than the details of the circadian rhythms and such, are, can you anticipate and do a better job of avoiding or predicting and avoiding hypotension? Because one of the key things that we've seen in trials, that this big question of how low can you go before the downside of treating blood pressure outweighs the benefits, and perhaps the personalization of that would be like an area where there's more to gain. I think the effect sizes of these issues of changes in blood pressure, there are many things that drive that, including circadian rhythms, but there's the I got cut off in traffic, there's my boss yelled at me this afternoon, there's 100 other kinds of things, and what the prognostic implications of those are really complicated. The circadian issues with blood pressure has also been complicated. There's a whole story of research fraud in some of the blood pressure trials around treatment of that as well. So, but I think this other issue of how is hypotension in hypertensive patients becoming a problem or not could be really, really an interesting application of this.
That's fantastic. And yeah, I think again, I'm now going to the engineering level of, can I figure out on a beat to beat what's going on consistently? But a natural condition out of this is I'm not going to give you beat to beat blood pressures for the next 6 months and have you figure out how to clinically make use of that, right? There needs to then eventually be some kind of summarization and sort of another level of sort of exploration of figuring out how the variations and what relationships really come out there of being predictive and being able to help, keep track of target treatments. So if I'm giving you something that's lowering the blood pressure, how quickly can I measure the effectiveness of that and such then? So these are fantastic questions. I love the discussion. I don't want to jump through details too quickly. So, but I'm going to try to go through here and now dive in a bit to some of the engineering and the machine learning here. The question that comes across is how do you understand these key features without having to annotate every cycle, right? So we know clinically what the relationships is here with respect to where we should be measuring in relation to diastolic blood pressure, when we should be measuring with respect to systolic blood pressure, the amount of time that takes. So from this point to that point, you're getting, a cycle of what is your heart rate? As the heart rate increases and you're pushing more blood through, how does that relate to blood pressure? We know these points matter, but across individuals, where exactly those points lie tends to vary. And again, it's a setting where if I had an infinite supply of data, I'm sure there are some even better machine learning experts than I in the audience here that can speak to how well it would be able to eventually identify those points. But one of the questions that we've asked is saying, well, we know some biomedical knowledge and some clinical knowledge here of knowing there are some key points, and there may be other relationships that are more important in terms of eventually figuring out blood pressure and trends of blood pressure. But can we figure out how to annotate some of the data and then leverage those key fiducial points to then automate the rest of the process, right? So this is where we sort of want to start, of saying how do we guide the model to at least get a better sense of increases and decreases, so that the R squared goes up and then we worry about the RMSE. So that's the student leading this work is Jonathan Martinez, and sort of take this as a two-step process. We take from sort of more fundamental signal processing this idea of a dynamic time warping. So what a dynamic time warping does is it basically, we are able to identify in a couple points that we annotate. So we sit down with an expert and talk about where are the key points within a cardiac cycle. How do you identify that it's a cardiac cycle? How do you identify the relationship? And then we sort of compute how similarly over time signals are matching each other, or they need to be warped, right? So these both represent the same peaks. These both represent maybe the same inflection point, and then a secondary peak here, but the amplitudes change. The similarities vary over a course of each individual and over a course of different heartbeats as they change. And so an interesting question would be, first, how much noise is there present, as we've seen that there's noise in these signals inherently, so I can warp some of these signals back and match them together better to say, no, these are indeed the same cycles at the same rates with the same blood pressures, versus no, I have now a wide distance and these are in fact different blood pressures, different heart rates, different segments. But across all of them, I can identify the key points, the onset of a cycle, the maximum slope point, the systolic points, and I can, with minimal annotation of a couple key templates of what look like key cardiac cycles at different levels of blood pressure, I can then give this in a method which the algorithms can then go ahead and label the rest of the data for me. And I can evaluate the effectiveness of those labels. And this work was recently published, shows that you are in fact pretty good at annotating and then matching annotations across this and being flexible across different participants. So I can annotate a signal cycle for each individual, and it can learn some of the relationship and how to change and shift to each individual as I develop each individual's predictive model. So this is a pre-processing step where effectively allows me to annotate what I think are key points in the cardiac cycle. So again, I eventually want to allow a deep learning technique to extract out relationships over heartbeats that it can find in a recurrent fashion, but I can also help guide it. And I can guide it by basically telling it, boy, you should probably pay a little bit of attention to where these points are and how far apart they are in each cycle. And if I can tell it, you should attend to these specific areas, I can then sort of jointly develop a loss function where I tell it, I want you to balance finding these key fiducial points in each cycle versus just automating it and figuring out what you can find internally recurrently to regress blood pressure. And in the sense here, I can sort of jointly optimize finding key points to teach it that in this case, I know that this recurrent is architecture is looking at a very cyclical piece of data that has very defined physics relationships, even if I don't know exactly how tight they are, right? So again, going back to the question at the very beginning that's been prompting all of this, I know there's a relationship between the pulse transit times. I know there's a relationship for each beat and the changes in each beat to the changes in blood pressure. And I know that they have something to do with these key points, but I don't know exactly what. And I allow this technique to actually sort of balance the trade-off between pushing it in a very manual feature extraction point of view and letting it automate and take power in, you know, the deep networks and the architectures that exist there. And by doing this, we're actually then able to sort of jointly both predict how well we can find annotations, as well as use that to improve our blood pressure. And the illustration here is in our bioimpedance, but just to remind you, we actually track this technique across both data sets. So what we do is we sort of annotate with a cardiologist of what we think are the different signals and the different key points, and then we run this. So we take the waveform and we run it against a couple of different architectures, and the question came about, and I'm going to finally give you numbers. What is the correlation between what we're regressing as being the actual blood pressures and the actual blood pressure values? And then we try it over some sort of more simplistic and more complicated deep architectures to show that if you guide it, you give it this guided attention, that it can attend to signals faster than perhaps it would be able to do naively. And so in each case, we get a small bump in correlation and a small improvement in RMSE, right? So for the ECG and PPG type of setting, we're getting a reasonably high correlation, but our error is still pretty high, and boy, the variance across people across folds is still noisy, but does seem to show some promise in improving that, and more importantly, in our data, in our BioZ data, healthier population, more controlled setting than an arterial line in an hospital, but doing again reasonably well with respect to error, but with high variance and reasonable correlation. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry to ask so many questions. Just to clarify,
no, I love it.
Is the BioZ, like, which was the training here and which was the validation? Or are they separately trained?
It's separate. So for each individual, I'm training on a first segment and I'm testing on another. I'm cross-validating on its own data internally.
Within individual
Within
training.
Individuals, yeah.
Got it. Sorry for missing.
No. Sorry. Yeah, it's great question. So we start to get a sense of, all right, so this again, we're building this sequentially, right? So we are now able to roughly correlate. We are able to improve across sensing modalities by injecting some knowledge and some understanding that there is inherent noise and there is inherent changes in the relationship, but our errors themselves are still kind of low, right? So if I'm giving you a device and I'm telling you, boy, 7 millimeter mercury error with a potential range 8 up and down, right? So then I tell you 130, but you don't know, is that 120, is that 140? So what can we do for that? So we come back actually to Jenna's question of there's a lot of noise both in the target and in the input, in fact. So one question that my student Jala is working on is saying, well, how do we enhance that further? So when we think about this in free living settings and even in our sort of controlled environments, these non-invasive signals are actually much more susceptible to noise, motion noise, sensors being worn improperly. And as you're looking at this more and more continuously, you need a better sense of what's good data and what isn't. And the guided attention approach sort of gave us our first taste of that, of saying, boy, if you can tell it what really looks good and what doesn't, it seems to do a better and better job for each person figuring out the signals that it needs to learn to model from and the ones it can throw out. And we said, boy, let's see if we can sort of in an unsupervised fashion take that a step further. We know each person will have certain sorts of waveforms, and if you encode and decode this in a variational encoder, you get, again, a reasonable representation subject to some noise that may actually generalize a little bit better in finding what's happening. So we pipe the data in to such a setting, and what we want to know is if in the latent space that's created, we are able to sort of self-select and clean the data, similar to what we were doing in the guided attention, where we were manually picking key points and key signals. We're saying, boy, that has a big key constraint in that I still need to go in and identify what I think are clean signals with clean labels and a clean template. And I'm saying, I wonder if now that I have a sense of what that looks like, if I can teach a model to do it for me. And so what I can do is I can take this embedded data for each heartbeat encoded, and I can, in a t-SNE plot, look at roughly how close and how far things are in the embedded space. And I can see that there are morphological differences between points that are far away and similarities for points that are close to each other. And I can start to leverage that and say, boy, cool, I wonder if I can sort of group things together and then get a sense of, a natural question to ask, are these two next to each other, are their blood pressures the same or not? And if they are, that can help us, right? So what we do is we sort of group in the encoded space, we sort of use a Gaussian mixture model to cluster together, to start to guess what are the different kinds of patterns that we see at each sort of bucketed area of blood pressure. And so what we start to get are signals that we decide are similar to each other and are clean, look very similar morphologically. And then the ones that have very weird shapes, effectively ones that the dynamic time warping and the guided attention had no idea how to figure out where the key points were, start to look very far away in the encoded space. And I color code them here. What this is sort of telling us is that signals that are clean for the heartbeats all sort of give us the same sort of characteristics. So they give us the ability to see the pulse transit time. They see where there's a drop in the impedance because of the systolic, the influx of red blood cells. And then, maybe the person started talking or they shifted because they were uncomfortable sitting. And all of a sudden you get this weird thing that doesn't look like our standard drop, up, drop, like the patterns start to change. And what we wanted to figure out was if the model can figure out the difference between when the patterns are different because of different blood pressures and when the patterns are different because of just the inherent noise of collecting this on a beat-to-beat basis. And so then we go back to the exact same architecture that we developed, but we stick this sort of self-selection up front. And so again, for the training and testing for each individual, we have a sequence of trials in which they collect the data. We take part of it, train it, we take part of it, validate the hyperparameters, and then we take the last part that we've held out and we test to see how well we regress against that. But now we self-select through this autoencoder what input data to give to the network and what input data we decide is noisy. And the hypothesis here is that, again, for the question that, the comment that Brahmaji brought up earlier is that, let's say we eventually get this to a point that works, over the course of a day, you're going to be doing a lot of things that are going to vary your blood pressure. If I can sort of guess when at you're sedentary and in the right setting to take measurements versus, what I'm doing right now and waving my hands all over the place is going to be complete noise. I can, at least in some of those obvious settings, throw out data and say, I don't want to bias it, because if I throw all that in there, it eventually gives up with the noise and just says, 120 over 80. And it turns out we can start to push that correlation even higher. again, across different techniques, we see correlation improvements by using this, again, per participant. But more importantly, we start to even drive now the RMSEs lower, right? So now we're getting down to one of the modelings having root mean square error of only 4.5 millimeter mercury error with a standard deviation across trials and across participants of 5. So now I'm starting to get a little bit closer. If I looked at how the errors are distributed, is it uniform? Fantastic question. Yes. So in these settings, the errors tend to be distributed, and I wish I had a Bland-Altman plot to show that at the moment. They tend to be very good in the bulk, and they tend to break down at the tails of the distribution. So the model is not amazing at extrapolating up to, say, like 160 when it's seeing 120 over 140, but it's still well correlated, but it'll start to vary. But in this latest approach, as we start to throw out some of the noisy signals, the error tends to be more uniform. So that's helping us in this case.
How many signals are you throwing out? And on those signals, those are all collected, I imagine, while the patient is not waving their hands and things like that.
Yeah, so for the most part, so that's a fantastic question. How much do we throw out? We tend to throw out about 20 to 30% of the data. So in an hour and a half trial, we still select a strong number of clean signals. The question is, yeah, so why are you throwing some out, especially in our data where it's still a controlled setting, where they're sitting in a lab, they're doing certain motions. And part of it is to do with annotation error, right? So I can tell the participant, okay, now go put your feet in the bucket for the cold presser test. And I have a trial participant marking down in red cap at what time mark they start this, right? But there's some noise there, right? I can fill in and look at a clock, but not everything is perfectly synced, and I'll never be able to get everything perfectly synced. And then there's things that as I shift and as I do this over and over again, you know, maybe I start sweating from hand gripping, and then it slides around. There's a lot of things that can cause the noise, and we don't throw everything out. So this isn't a setting where you know, I threw out 95% of the data, and so then I get an accurate model here. We're still keeping about 80%. So we're just getting rid of the ones where it's saying, boy, the model has no idea what's happening. And to Jenna's questions, those don't also, that's not always 160 and 100. It tends to be evenly distributed across blood pressure ranges. That's effectively how we get these sort of different cluster centroids are at the different blood pressure ranges. So right, this is your sort of mean blood pressures, and then these are the variant, you know, the different low and high ranges to answer that question. So, just keep track of time here. Okay, yeah. So let me jump ahead a little bit here. Just to get us going. So the last question, which is actually going to say, all right, let's again, a fantastic question that leads into exactly what I want to talk about next, which is you have these hour and a half data, you have this across each individual participant. How can you start to extract out what's happening on an individual level? And how can I eventually start to realize the goal of a new person wants to get this, and I don't want to have to train them over an hour and a half over all kinds of distributions of blood pressures. I want to be able to just sort of anchor them and then trust the model will work. So here we learn a little bit from adversarial learning literature, which is to say, you know, for each individual model, we're learning their relationship, and we're learning their arterial compliance in sort of the latent space, and we're learning the changes in blood pressure and the changes in the morphology. And from the very beginning, we know that there is an overall equation that is supposed to represent how this works for everybody. Can we sort of learn how to split the differences of what's for a specific person, the features that are getting extracted, and what's the hemodynamic parameters that are being matched? And can we try to get focused on the latter, and then use just minimal calibrating data to then fit back to a specific person? So the training here is now no longer individual. So now the training is, I take pairs of people constantly through training, and I look at how well I can basically take all of the people generally, train this model, and then in a test person, how can I use a little bit of data to sort of transfer learn this sort of shared network here between what adapts to the person and what doesn't, so that with minimal data, now on the order of minutes, I can predict what's happening with blood pressure. So what we do here is, now for every new test person, we take just 5 minutes of data, 10 minutes of data, and we see if we can meet standards of keeping these errors low. And the standards that we see from the FDA side and from the ISO standards is you want to be within 10% of your ground truth measurement 85% of the time. So we take that from 10 minutes and we try to shrink it, and we just uniformly sample, so we don't worry about the ranges of blood pressures that are found in that yet. And I think this is sort of the plot that I should have had for the prior one that says how are the errors distributed here. So now when I start to try to build a general model and then fit it to individual people rather than build some really deep personalized model that takes an hour of data to train it, I get, again, reasonable correlations with only 4 minutes of data. I do seem to now tend a little bit more towards the mean blood pressures. So I'm a little bit underestimating in one end and overestimating in the other, in the extreme ranges, but I still do okay, and I'm still well correlated even with low diastolic and high diastolic, low systolic and high systolic blood pressures here. And then more importantly, now that I've got this sort of relationship, what I really want to test is how much blood pressure do I need on this new person to really be able to calibrate it? What if I get rid of segments? So what if I only train with certain bits? How well does this interpolate and extrapolate? And so we can do is we can, for each person's trainings, we can actually eliminate segments of data and see if that error that we're finding is biasing because it's seeing 120/80 a lot, or if it's subject to the training data. And it turns out that it's fairly robust. If I take these gaps of blood pressures where I remove them from training and I give it segments, even when I get rid of the extremes, I still see a very consistent pattern where the unseen data is predict and overlap with everybody else's for these data sets. So again, while I do start to degrade a little bit in the extremes, and so this would suggest for a healthy participant that we're modeling this on, if they ever hit 200 systolic, you know, I might only be able to hit a bar that says you're over some alert. I can at least get the trend correct in those extremes. And in fact, just again, in the interest of time, I'll jump ahead and say that's actually sort of where we want to go, is to figure out how much of this variation matters. And with respect to the noise that we saw earlier and the noise we're seeing in ranges, can we summarize this a little bit to give you some time and range information rather than tell you exactly what the value is, right? So if depending on your activity, have you transitioned into specific ranges, and at what point should I be alerting either in an in-clinic setting or, you know, outside to see over time how well are you relating. And if I can start to smooth out there, I can probably get better values, and then I can potentially start sticking this into completely off the wall modeling techniques now, which is sort of unrelated, but you know, some of the work that, you know, some of the excellent people in Michigan do and some of the others have developed of even extracting out data and going back to a simple Cox proportional hazards model of understanding your time to event, your hazard risk, and how do you summarize this data in a way that you can then do some of the things that Bank mentioned of, you know, keeping track of when you need to start intervening and then how much that's intervening. And then even if I inverse this graph, right, of, oh, now, you know, I've been lowering your blood pressure, but now I'm pushing you a little too far in the other direction. And so, you know, we're just sort of at the beginning here of figuring out how we can really explore new signal processing techniques and new environments with the kind of data that we're getting that are really only possible by creating these sort of larger interdisciplinary blends of understanding the electrical engineering and the biomedical engineering to build these devices and understand the device physics. And then on the other end, the cardiology expertise of what are you going to do with this data, and then sitting here with these analytics as the glue logic in between. And so, you know, just to acknowledge the different funding agencies and the different collaborators from biomedical engineering to cardiology that are sort of laying the foundation of what we think now is a device that can work. And so now how do we start to target very interesting clinical questions with it? And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Bobak. That was great. Any questions from the group? I guess I can kick off with, like, as you feel like, it sounds like you feel like this is enough preliminary data to at least see that you're seeing some kinds of signals within individuals. What are you thinking about with Harlan and Erica? Are you thinking about putting this device on individuals? And have you started to kind of produce these devices so that you can kind of collect data now, kind of in an outpatient cohort? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So actually, yeah, so the devices are being manufactured. At QCore, I actually sat down with Erica to finalize the protocol itself now, which is to go now into the CCU with people with A-lines and put this device on them and start to see if we can collect some of the more interesting clinical data, not only with the relationship changing over the breadth of participants that we can collect, but in a setting in which some are hypertensive and some are on medications that are altering blood flow and some that are on medications altering vascular compliance, and trying to extend out and remove the constraints. And then the initial intention was always to go eventually out the door with respect to ambulatory blood pressure monitors. We think we need to still solve this problem of participant data shift as we change the clinical conditions before we get there. And actually the ambulatory blood pressure study that we developed ran into some really interesting practical challenges. You know, the participants are primarily in the Caribbean, and the space labs, maybe I shouldn't mention the company, I don't want to besmirch a company, but the company providing the ABPMs did not really help out the fact that these things were melting in the heat. So, you know, we have hundreds of participants in the trial, and ultimately I have 65 people's worth of data, because it's hard to get these things to work. So even the ground truth is problematic there. So, you know, while we're talking about nocturnal and the circadian rhythms and these remote sensing environments, I think for the time being, there's some very interesting challenges of just even in clinic settings. How do we get enough data to understand where you are depending on your classification of hypertension, sustained hypertension, and making sure that the modeling technique is robust to some of the label noise, and exploring and extracting the key time points that matter before we then walk out the door and say, great, can I replace this ABPM and actually start to get real settings and real free living condition blood pressures to get a better sense of what, you know, your averages look like awake and asleep and in activity and while sedentary.
No, that'll be certainly exciting. And as you kind of alluded to, I mean, even our gold standards in these situations, I can tell you from a clinical standpoint, that when you even order ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, usually about a third of the measures oftentimes get thrown out because they're just inadequate. So, yeah. Wonderful. Any other questions or comments? Bobak, thanks for coming, and thanks for putting together a great talk for us. We really appreciate it. This is definitely at the interface between a lot of clinical interest and then obviously a lot of machine learning, and then even some engineering and hardware development too, which is very cool. So
yeah, no, thank you. Hopefully, yeah, the connection sometimes makes it a little bit diffuse. So I hope that, you know, the questions I think help to keep it connected, and I appreciate the time everybody spent in listening and the fantastic discussions, and happy to follow up at every level of detail across hardware to ML. If anybody has some follow-on questions, feel free to email, and I would love to keep talking.
Awesome. Thanks, Bobak.
Thank you all. Take
care. Bye.